June 1941. The Hellfire Pass, Egypt, 11 kilometers from the Libyan border. To the men of the British Eighth Army, it wasn't Hellfire, it was Hellfire Pass, and they earned that name the hard way. Imagine sitting inside a Matilda II tank. You are the pride of British armor. You have 78 millimeters of frontal protection, enough to shrug off almost anything the Italians or Germans have thrown at you so far. You feel invincible. You advance into what looks like empty, shimmering desert. Then the first shell hits. It's not a thud, it's a supersonic crack that splits the air before the sound of the gun even reaches you. One Matilda brews up, flames roaring from the turret hatch, then another, then another. Within minutes, 11 of His Majesty's finest tanks are burning wrecks. Their armor hasn't just been hit, it has been punched clean through from over a kilometer away. The surviving crews who limped back to British lines were shaken, asking one desperate question: what the hell just hit us? The answer was the German 88mm Flak gun, an anti-aircraft weapon that Rommel had dug into shallow pits behind sand berms, camouflaged and waiting. He had turned a weapon designed to shoot down bombers into the ultimate tank killer. That gun would become the boogeyman of North Africa. But here is the tragic irony that those burning tank crews did not know. Sitting in depots, guarding harbors, and stationed at airfields often miles behind their own lines, the British had a gun of their own, a gun that was actually bigger, actually more powerful, and actually capable of doing exactly what the 88 had just done to them, perhaps even better. They had hundreds of them, and yet, while Rommel's tanks rampaged across the desert, these guns were almost strictly forbidden from lowering their barrels to fight back. This is the story of the QF 3.7-inch anti-aircraft gun, the weapon that could have given the Afrika Korps a taste of their own Meeson, and the stubborn, doctrinal rigidity that ensured it almost never did. The tactical nightmare. To understand the tragedy of the 3.7-inch gun, you first have to understand the mathematics of death in the Western Desert. By 1941, the Afrika Korps had perfected a devastating system. It worked like a trap. German Panzers would engage British armor, exchange fire, and then feign a retreat. The British, aggressive and eager to close the distance, would pursue. They would charge forward, engines roaring, driving straight into a pre-sighted killing ground of concealed 88mm guns dug into the desert floor. The disparity in firepower was almost criminal. The standard British anti-tank gun, the 2-pounder, was a pop gun by comparison. It could penetrate roughly 40 millimeters of steel at 1,000 meters. Against the newer Panzer III and IV variants, with their hardened frontal armor, this was dangerously inadequate. British crews had to wait until the Panzers closed to point-blank range, sometimes under 500 meters, before their shots had any real chance of penetrating. By then, they were usually already dead. A German Panzer or an 88 crew could engage a British tank at 1,500 meters with lethal accuracy. That meant a British crew had to cross a full kilometer of open ground under fire before they could even shoot back effectively. Tank commanders called this the death ride. It cost the Eighth Army hundreds of vehicles and thousands of men. The 88mm Flak, firing its 9-kilogram shell at 800 meters per second, could penetrate 105 millimeters of armor at that distance. It could kill a Matilda before the British crew even realized they were under fire. The Rommel didn't just use these guns as support, he integrated them into his panzer divisions. They moved with the tanks, they set up in minutes. By late 1941, contemporary accounts credit just 2 Luftwaffe Flak battalions in North Africa with destroying over 200 tanks. Even if we account for the fog of war and overclaiming, the ratio is astonishing. The British needed a counter. They needed a weapon that could reach out and crush German armor at long range. They needed a heavy hitter to make German tank commanders fear the open desert. The frustrating truth is, they already had one. The superior machine. Enter the 3.7. It was called the quick-firing 3.7-inch anti-aircraft gun, and by every meaningful ballistic measure it was superior to the German weapon that was slaughtering British crews. The 3.7-inch emerged from a 1933 specification demanding a weapon capable of engaging modern bombers at 35,000 feet. The design, delivered by Vickers Armstrongs, was a masterpiece of British heavy engineering. Let's look at the numbers because they tell the story of wasted potential. The German 88 had a bore of, naturally, 88 millimeters. The British gun measured 94 millimeters, 6 millimeters wider. The German shell weighed about 9 kilograms, the British shell 12.7 kilograms, nearly 40% heavier. Muzzle velocity for the British gun reached 792 meters per second in the standard mark, and when fitted with armor-piercing ammunition, the 3.7 had kinetic energy that dwarfed the 88. It was capable of defeating any German tank then in service, including the Tiger I that would appear later at standard combat ranges. But the superiority wasn't just in the size of the shell, it was in the delivery. The rate of fire matched the German weapon at 8 to 10 rounds per minute with hand loading. But by 1942, the British introduced the Mollins automatic fuse setter. This mechanical marvel pushed the rate of fire to a staggering 20 to 25 rounds per minute. Imagine that volume of fire directed at a tank column, a 13-kilogram shell slamming into a Panzer every 2.5 seconds. A later variant, the Mark VI, introduced in 1943, extended the barrel length to 65 calibers. It achieved a muzzle velocity of over 1,000 meters per second with a ceiling of 45,000 feet. It was, quite possibly, the finest heavy anti-aircraft weapon produced by any nation during the war. And we built thousands of them. In January 1938, Britain had only 180 heavy AA guns. By the end of the war, production across Britain, Australia, and Canada pushed that number into the thousands. The capability existed, the ammunition existed, yet these guns sat protecting rear area depots while tank crews burned in the desert. The valid excuses: weight and radar. So why? Why did the British refuse to use their supergun against tanks? Historians and apologists often point to technical limitations, and to be fair, these were not trivial. First, there was the weight. The 3.7-inch gun was a beast. In its mobile configuration, it weighed 9,300 kilograms, nearly 2 tons heavier than the German 88. It stood over 3 meters tall when traveling, presenting an enormous target that was almost impossible to conceal in the flat, coverless desert. Then there was the deployment time. The German 88 was designed with a dual role in mind. It could fire from its traveling wheels using simple outriggers. A well-drilled German crew could stop their truck and have the first round downrange in 2.5 minutes. The British gun? It required a full setup. The wheels had to be lifted, the massive cruciform steel platform lowered and staked to the ground. This took a well-drilled crew 15 minutes. In the fluid chaos of tank warfare, 15 minutes is a lifetime. There was also the issue of sighting. The 3.7 was a high-tech weapon designed for the age of radar. It was meant to be aimed by mechanical computers called predictors that calculated lead angles against high-flying bombers. It wasn't designed for a gunner to look down a barrel and blast a tank 500 yards away. Field modifications called Derby sights attempted to graft anti-tank telescopes onto the mount, but crews hated them.
They were awkward, vibrating violently with every shot. Veterans also reported that the gun's recoil mechanism, designed for high-angle fire, hated being fired horizontally. Recoil springs would snap, hydraulic seals would burst.
These were real problems. But here is the counterpoint. The Germans faced many of these same problems with the 88. They solved them. They built simplified sights. They modified the carriage. They trained for it. The British had the engineering capability to solve these issues in weeks. They didn't solve them because fundamentally they didn't want to. The institutional failure. The deeper failure wasn't mechanical, it was organizational. It was a failure of imagination and bureaucracy. In Britain, heavy anti-aircraft guns belonged to Anti-Aircraft Command, and effectively, AA Command worked for the Royal Air Force. Their priority was the defense of British airspace, airfields and ports. This created a massive conflict of interest. In the Middle East, heavy anti-aircraft regiments were deployed to protect logistics hubs, not to fight at the front. AA Command measured its success by aircraft shot down or raids deterred. They did not get medals for destroying tanks. Commanders who had watched the Luftwaffe devastate undefended positions in France and Crete were terrified of stripping away air protection. To take a battery of 3.7s away from an airfield and send them to the front lines meant accepting the risk that the airfield might be bombed into oblivion. There was also a fierce logistical turf war. Anti-aircraft batteries consume massive amounts of high-explosive ammunition. To use them against tanks, you need armor-piercing rounds. Introducing AP rounds into the supply chain meant complicating logistics. It meant the Royal Artillery and the RAF arguing over shipping tonnage. Compare this to the German approach. The Germans deliberately stocked armor-piercing ammunition for their flak guns from day one. This wasn't an accident, it was doctrine. They had learned this lesson in the Spanish Civil War. Between 1936 and 1939, the German Condor Legion deployed 4 batteries of Flak 18 guns. They engaged in 377 combat actions. Only 31 of those were against aircraft. The vast majority were against tanks and bunkers. Rommel was there. He saw it. He personally used 88s and 105mm guns to stop a British counterattack at Arras in France in 1940. When he arrived in Africa, he didn't have to invent a new tactic. He just applied what the Wehrmacht already knew. The gun was a tool, and they used it for whatever job was at hand. The British, meanwhile, viewed the 3.7 as a scientific instrument for shooting down planes, and any other use was considered misuse of valuable equipment. Proof of concept: when the giants fought. Despite this institutional resistance, we know the 3.7 was a devastating tank killer because on the rare occasions it was allowed to fight, it was terrifying. The siege of Tobruk in 1941 offers the best proof. The 51st London Heavy Anti-Aircraft Regiment was trapped inside the perimeter. With their backs to the sea, necessity overrode doctrine. They used their 24 guns to engage everything: German airfields, Axis artillery, and yes, tanks. War diaries from the 94th Heavy AA Regiment document multiple instances where guns were depressed to engage ground targets. In September 1942, General Alexander himself, the commander of the theatre, watched a demonstration of the 3.7 firing against ground targets. The report was glowing, very effective. The guns were accurate and fragmentation was excellent. At El Alamein in June 1942, after the disaster at Gazala, a Brigadier Dennis Reed finally snapped. He authorized his AA guns to engage attacking armor.
They fired just 200 rounds. The result? The German tank attack stalled instantly. The commanders refused to press into that wall of heavy fire and sought easier targets elsewhere. The 3.7 had demonstrated exactly the capability that British tank crews had been begging for. And yet, even after these successes, the policy didn't officially change. The guns went back to looking at the sky. The tortoise and the bureaucracy. The deeper failure was sought to make the gun mobile. There were advocates within the system. Brigadier Percy Calvert claimed to have solved the deployment problems by 1942. There was even a project to mount the 3.7-inch gun onto a tank chassis, effectively creating a British Tiger or Jag Panther.
This project eventually evolved into the A-39 Tortoise heavy assault tank. It carried a 32-pounder, a weapon derived directly from the 3.7-inch AA gun. The ballistic performance was monstrous. It could punch through a Panther tank's frontal armor as if it were cardboard. But the project stalled. Why? Because the Royal Artillery and the Royal Armoured Corps could not agree on who would own the resulting vehicle. Was it a tank, or was it a self-propelled gun? The paperwork war delayed the project until it was too late to matter. The Tortoise only arrived in prototype form just as the war ended. Instead of adapting the weapon they had in 1941, the British spent years developing entirely new anti-tank guns, the 6-pounder and eventually the famous 17-pounder. These were excellent weapons, don't get me wrong. The 17-pounder Firefly was the only Allied tank capable of reliably killing Tigers. But the 17-pounder didn't arrive in numbers until 1943. For 2 critical years, the years of the Crusader battles, Gazala and the fall of Tobruk, the British Army had a capability gap that the 3.7-inch could have filled. Legacy and the what-if. By the time the British finally got comfortable using the 3.7 in a ground role, primarily in Normandy and Italy, the tank threat had largely passed. By 1944, they were using it as a bunker buster, firing high explosives into concrete fortifications. It was valued highly for this, but the moment for it to be the savior of the desert had gone. Interestingly, the Germans knew exactly how good the gun was. They captured enough of them to give them an official designation, the 94mm Flak Vickers M39E. They even manufactured their own ammunition for it. That designation tells you everything. The enemy recognized the value of the weapon more clearly than the generals who owned it. Today, nearly 80 years after the design process began, a handful of these guns reportedly remain in ceremonial service with the Nepalese army. It stands as a testament to the sheer quality of the engineering. So, was the refusal to use the 3.7-inch gun the reason the British struggled in North Africa? It's a seductive theory, the idea that stupid generals ignored a magic wand that could have won the war in a month. The reality, as always, is nuanced. The British did need those guns to protect the ports that brought in the food, fuel and ammo. If the Luftwaffe had strangled the supply lines, the tanks would have stopped running anyway. The technical hurdles of weight and sighting were real constraints that would have made the gun difficult to use in an offensive role. But constraints are meant to be overcome. The Germans overcame them. The British chose not to. The 3.7-inch anti-aircraft gun proves that having superior technology means nothing without the doctrine to employ it. It proves that wars are not just won by engineers, they are won by organizations that are willing to adapt, improvise, and break the rules. When British tank crews burnt at Hellfire Pass, when Matildas brewed up across the killing grounds of Gazala, they didn't know that the most powerful gun in the desert was sitting 10 miles behind them, perfectly maintained, pointing safely at an empty sky. They deserved better.
If you enjoyed this deep dive into the technical and tactical failures of the Desert War, consider subscribing. It helps us keep the lights on and the history alive. Let us know in the comments, do you think the risk to the airfields justified holding these guns back, or was it a blunder that cost thousands of lives? See you in the next one.